In today's episode, I'll talk about two interesting stories. In the first one, I'll talk about why China's quiet pressure on Foxconn could really test the future of India's iPhone manufacturing dream. And in the second story of the day, I'll talk about why global trade might actually be stopping poor countries from getting richer. Welcome to the Daily Brief Show by Zerodha, where our aim is to cut through the noise and simplify the biggest news and stories in the financial markets in a way that is easy for all of us to understand, yet one level deeper as compared to your traditional news channels. I'm your host Anurag Bansal, and today is Friday, the 11th of July. In early July 2025, something very strange happened at Foxconn's iPhone factories in India. The company very quietly pulled out more than 300 Chinese engineers and technicians who had been working at its facilities here. They didn't really say much about why they were doing this, but it was not really the first time such a move had happened. And the timing and scale of this exit also raised many questions, not just about Foxconn or Apple, but about India's entire industrial strategy. So to understand why all of this matters, let's quickly step back and ask, what exactly is Foxconn really doing in India in the first place? And why did India work so hard to bring them in the first place? So to understand why all of this matters, we need to take a quick step back and ask ourselves, what exactly is Foxconn even doing in India? Why did India work so hard to bring them in? And what does this recent Chinese worker exit really mean for our bigger picture? Now, to give you some context, Foxconn is one of the world's biggest electronics manufacturers. It is based in Taiwan, and it is most famous for making iPhones for Apple. But its reach goes far beyond that. It assembles everything, right from TVs to gaming consoles and even computer parts. Now in China, it has built massive industrial zones just so that it can make Apple products, which are entire cities, in fact, dedicated to iPhone assembly lines. Now India, for our part, has waited very long to be a part of this very story. We have a large young population and also a growing economy and a government that has been sort of desperate to expand manufacturing. So when India actually convinced Foxconn to set up shop here, it was seen as a very big deal, not just for the jobs that it would create, but for the kind of industrial ripple effects that it could potentially trigger. Now, mind you, this was not just about one company or one product. The hope was that Foxconn's presence would attract other firms as well, like packaging suppliers, component makers, logistics companies, and even direct competitors. Now, the thing is, generally these groups usually follow each other, and when they are all located in one place, they form what economists call an industrial cluster. Now, to give you some context, clusters feed off each other's scale and skill. You can sort of think about how Surat's diamond industry grew, or maybe how Bangalore's tech parks also developed for that matter. So bringing Foxconn to India was just a way to jumpstart a new electronics cluster from scratch in our country. But of course, building such a cluster is not at all easy. So India sort of bent over backwards to make things attractive for Foxconn and also Apple. It started with major policy changes. In 2020, the government launched a production-linked incentive or PLI scheme for smartphones and other sectors. The idea was fairly simple. The more you manufacture in India, the more incentives you get. Now, Foxconn signed up very quickly and was eventually allocated over 2,800 crore rupees under that very scheme. And to make local production more appealing, India also raised import duties on finished phones. Now, that meant Apple had to either pay high taxes or make its products locally. And to help them even further, India tweaked its rules around local sourcing. Earlier, companies like Apple had to source at least 30% of their components from within India if they wanted to open stores here. But that rule was relaxed, and now even exporting phones from India counted as local sourcing. And that made Apple India's plan far more viable. Another big challenge was around foreign investment. See, until a few years ago, foreign firms like Foxconn had to partner with Indian companies so that they could set up operations over here. But again, the rules were updated to allow 100% foreign ownerships in contract manufacturing. And that, of course, gave Foxconn complete control, which made India even more attractive for them. And it's not just that, alongside all of this, Indian states stepped up as well. Tamil Nadu and Karnataka became especially aggressive in attracting Foxconn. They offered stable power, access to ports, cheap land, and most importantly, a skilled workforce that could work at lower wages than China. They also helped build housing for workers and fast-tracked all the approvals that Foxconn needed, which, by the way, are things that usually take Indian firms months to do, and these were done in just a few weeks. Now, labor laws were relaxed as well. In 2023, Karnataka allowed the extension of working hours from 9 to 12 and even permitted women to work night shifts, which is something that Foxconn had wanted. Now, these were, of course, controversial changes, especially given Foxconn's global track record with labor rights. But again, India still went ahead with it anyway, where they were betting big on long-term payoffs. And to a large extent, it also worked. In just a few years, India has become the world's second largest iPhone producer. To give you a point of comparison, in FY 2014, we manufactured phones worth 18,900 crore rupees, and that number grew to over 4.2 lakh crore rupees by FY 2024. Exports alone are now worth 1.2 lakh crore rupees, and about 20% of all iPhones in the world are now made in India. The town of Sriperumbudur in Tamil Nadu, where one of Foxconn's plants is located, is turning into a hub for electronics manufacturing now. And the good news is that other industries are also starting to take notice. And this, of course, is exactly what India hoped for would happen. But again, all of this makes the July 2025 withdrawal of Chinese workers even more troubling for us, because it's not just about a company pulling out its staff, it is actually a stress test for the entire model that we've sort of built here. Now you might be asking, why are these Chinese workers here in the first place? See, that is because they held vital roles like engineers, line managers, and technicians who had the know-how to set up and run all of these complex production lines. They made up less than 1% of the total workforce in India, but they were very key to operations. And that is because the truth is that China, despite being Foxconn's political rival, is still deeply embedded in its entire supply chain. And this very dependence is what is now being weaponized. The first sign of trouble actually came a little earlier this year. In January, China delayed sending engineers to Foxconn's Indian factories. And around the same time, there were unexplained delays in shipments of crucial manufacturing machines, which are, by the way, machines that run on Chinese software. Foxconn even requested its suppliers to switch the software language to English, but such changes usually took months. And now there is fear that China might outright stop the exports of these machines to India altogether. And that, of course, would become a massive problem for us. Now, while Foxconn itself might be able to afford more expensive machines from other countries, the smaller firms that depend on it might really not be able to do that. And since margins in phone assembly are already razor thin, just by the way, to give you a number, Foxconn repeatedly makes just about 3%. So therefore, any cost increase can really kill the business altogether. It could weaken the entire cluster, so to speak. So anyway, then the point is, why is China even doing this? Now, of course, there is no official answer, but there are still some theories. Some people believe that it is retaliation for India tightening visa rules for Chinese nationals. Other people point out to the growing strategic rivalry between the two countries. India is trying to eat into China's role as the world's factory, and China, of course, does not want to give that up very easily. Labor-intensive manufacturing still makes up nearly about 1/3 of China's outputs, and any threat to that dominance will obviously be taken very seriously by the country. Anyway, whatever the reason is, the result is very clear for us. China still holds a surprising amount of control over India's manufacturing dreams, and it is starting to tighten that very grip. But that said, the story does not even end here. If anything, this episode may have opened a door altogether. See, Apple and Foxconn are not new to the idea that over-dependence on China is risky. Some experts even say that Apple anticipated this callback weeks in advance, and so they have already begun plugging the gap. Foxconn is now bringing in engineers from Taiwan, South Korea, and Vietnam to fill the roles that were left by Chinese workers. Yes, of course, this might raise costs in the short term, but early signs show that production has not slowed or declined in quality. Now again, India too seems fairly confident about this. The electronics minister Ashwini Vaishnav recently said that short-term problems are a part of any growth journey, but India is building its own capabilities slowly and steadily. Already, our country produces almost 1,000 different parts that go into a smartphone, and once a cluster gains momentum, it is obviously very hard to stop it. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what China might have actually underestimated here. See, over the past year or so, phone exports from China and Vietnam have both dropped, and India, interestingly, has picked up about 50% of that decline. Firms looking to reduce their exposure to China are now seeing India as a very, very serious alternative. Yes, of course, we've hit a speed bump, but India's phone manufacturing story is still very much on track, and if we keep our focus, we might just turn this challenge into a very big turning point. And that thought brings me to the end of the first story of the day. Let's now move on to the second story of the day. Have you ever wondered how countries grow rich? I'm not talking about temporarily richer, but sustainably over the long term. What does it really take for a country to move from poverty to prosperity? And how do you move from producing basic goods to building complex industries? And also, what role does trade actually play in that entire journey? Now, economists often explain this by using a simple metaphor, which is called a ladder. See, at the bottom of this ladder are countries that make the most basic things: steel rods, rolls of cloth, simple electronics, plastic toys, and so on and so forth. Now, these are, of course, products that do not need specialized skills or a very deep know how. They are relatively easy to make, but that also means that anybody can make them. So, the competition, of course, is intense and profits are also razor thin. Now, the goal for any developing country is to sort of climb that ladder up to start making things that are harder to produce and also more valuable to the larger world. Things like pharmaceuticals, aircraft engines, precision machinery, and also advanced semiconductors. Now, these products obviously require much more ingredients, more skilled workers, more capital, better institutions, and also more coordination among supply chains. But again, the reward is that they are harder to replicate. And of course, when fewer countries can compete in such a game, margins also naturally start to improve. Wages go up, economies grow stronger, and this journey from low complexity to high complexity is seen as that path to prosperity. And the one important thing that is supposed to help countries climb this ladder is trade. The thing with trade is that it exposes a country to global markets, because when local businesses get to compete with foreign ones, they are sort of forced to become more efficient. They learn faster, they invest in better technology, and the sheer pressure of competition at the bottom pushes countries to upgrade, and as they grow more capable, they also reach for higher rungs. But the question is, what if that theory misses something very big? That is a question that was raised by a very fascinating new paper by economists David Atkin, Arnold Costinot, and Masao Fukui. Please pardon me if I messed their names up. Anyway, they looked at trade data across nearly every country in the world, and they found something that is a little bit unsettling. Trade does not always help countries move up the ladder. In fact, in many cases, it actually seems to do the exact opposite. Their argument is that global trade, especially the way it works today, can trap developing countries on the lower rungs because of the ladder. Because the most powerful players at the top do not really leave much room for the others to climb. They call this the inverter ladder problem, and it really might explain why so many countries that opened up to trade over the last few decades have not really seen the kind of industrial progress that they were really hoping for. So anyway, without getting into the complications of it, let me break this down from the very basics for you. See, economists have for a very long time believed that development is not just about doing more of the same thing, it is about changing what you do. Most people in low-income countries work for what is called the traditional economy, which is farming, street vending, manual services, and so on and so forth. Now, these jobs, mind you, are of course important, but they do not create wealth at scale. To actually grow, countries have to shift people into higher productivity sectors like manufacturing and modern services. These jobs generate more value for each hour that is put in, and when that very shift happens across a large share of the population, the entire economy in general starts to transform. And that kind of change is called a structural transformation, and that is what happened with many Asian economies like South Korea, China, and also Vietnam, which grew rapidly over the last, say, 40 odd years. Now, a 2014 paper that our team found explored this puzzle as well. Why did Asia boom while Africa and Latin America stagnated? Now, the answer that they found at that time laid in how successfully each region moved its people into higher value work. Asian countries managed to create jobs in industries that use their biggest asset, which by the way, of course, is a large workforce willing to work at low wages, and they steadily upgraded those industries over time. Other regions could not really replicate that shift, but productivity again alone does not really tell us the entire story. There is another idea that adds more texture to this, which is economic complexity. See, the basic idea is this: every product is like a recipe, so to speak. To make something, you need a set of ingredients, which are raw materials, technical knowledge, equipment coordination, and so on and so forth. Some products will require a few ingredients, others might require 100 of them. An economy that can mix and match many of these ingredients in different ways is what is considered more complex. And it turns out that this complexity really matters and really matters a lot. In a research, two economists found that economic complexity is one of the best predictors of long-term growth. Countries like Japan and Germany, which export a wide range of sophisticated products, tend to have more stable and higher incomes than the countries which rely on just a handful of simple goods. And more importantly, countries do not grow by jumping randomly into new industries. They actually grow by gradually building on what they already know how to do, which is layering one set of capabilities on top of another one. Economic complexity then is not just a measure of what you've achieved, it is actually a roadmap of sorts of what you might be able to build next. And here is where trade was supposed to actually come in. The idea was that exporting forces companies to upgrade, and competing globally makes them adapt better practices. There is even solid evidence for this. One study by economist Paula Bustos in Argentina showed that exposure to export markets made firms adopt better technology and become more productive. But that is only a part of the story, because there is another side to trade that economists have been grappling with, which is something known as dynamic scale trade theory. It says that trade does not really just change on what you produce today, it changes on what you will be able to produce tomorrow. Now, one very well known example of this is the Dutch disease. See, when the Netherlands discovered large natural gas reserves, it started exporting them in huge volumes. That made its currency stronger, but that also hurt other parts of its economy, especially manufacturing, which became too expensive and uncompetitive as a result of it. Now, what looked like a blessing basically ended up hollowing out the entire country's industrial base. So the deeper point is that when an economy is actually tilted too far in one direction, trade can sort of reinforce that tilt once again. If you're already dependent on basic commodities or low-skill industries, for example, opening up to trade might really just deepen that dependence altogether. It actually might pull talent and investment away from complex sectors instead of actually pushing towards them. Now anyway, that's basically the backdrop to Atkin and his colleagues' paper. And to understand how trade really affects development over time, they studied 715 different products across 146 countries over a span of 50 long years. And the short-term results were exactly that most economists would expect, which is trade made consumers better off. Prices fell and product varieties increased. In Bangladesh, for instance, they found out that just opening up to global goods allowed households to consume 7% more. But that said, the longer-term picture was far more surprising here. They found out that when most countries opened up to trade, they didn't really shift towards more complex industries. Instead, they actually moved in the opposite direction, like I mentioned in the beginning. They specialized in simpler goods and they retreated into areas with lower barriers, lower learning curves, and lower margins. You might be wondering why. That is because the upper rungs of the ladder were not empty. They were packed. Now, it turns out that complex products like machinery, electronics, or pharmaceuticals are more competitive, not less. Many countries already export these goods, and the fight to stay competitive is pretty brutal. So when a new player starts to enter the global market, it very quickly realizes that it is easier to survive in low complexity industries. Now imagine a country that exports both medicines and garments. Now as soon as it opens up to global trade, it finds that foreign pharmaceutical companies are too hard to compete with. The margins are thin, the regulators are tight, and the global players are entrenched. But in garments, the entry barriers are lower. So the country makes a rational choice at that time. It shuts down the drug factories and it doubles down on apparel exports. Now in the long run, it is definitely earning, but it's not really learning. And this is not just a one-off, mind you. Researchers found that about 97% of countries experienced a dynamic loss from trade, which basically means that they grew more slowly than they would have if they had stayed closed. Only about 3% of countries actually benefited from complexity terms. The average penalty was about 2.5%, which of course is not huge, but it is meaningful enough to matter when compounded over many decades. And one of the biggest reasons for this was China. See, when China joined the WTO in 2001, it completely changed the game over there. China exported a huge volume of moderately complex goods, which is everything from electronics to processed machinery. And at the very same time, it also imported mostly simple goods like minerals, raw materials, and agricultural produce. Now, this created a kind of global asymmetry. China competed directly with most advanced sectors of other developing countries while simultaneously demanding their most basic outputs, and that tilted the incentives of trade. Take Ghana, for example. In the late 1990s, it was slowly building a light manufacturing sector, but after China entered the WTO, that sector got wiped out by cheaper Chinese imports. And at the same time, Ghana's traditional exports like cocoa and minerals became more valuable thanks to China's growing appetite. So Ghana basically shifted back to commodities. Its economy became less complex, not more. Researchers estimate that if China had not entered global trade when it did, many developing countries, especially in Africa, would be 5 to 8% higher in product complexity today. They still gained from cheaper goods for sure, but they lost out on the long-term path to industrial growth. But anyway, I know all of this is too much gyan for a day, but for those of us who have made it so far into the episode, the natural question is, what should people like you and I make of all of this? See, now this paper is not just a case against trade. It clearly recognizes the short-term gains, but it raises a deeper question, which is what happens to your economic future when you compete in a world where the upper rungs are already full. Now, this is something that India is also confronting right now. We've made big bets on advanced manufacturing like semiconductors, electronics, and clean technology, but progress has sort of been slower than it is expected. And a part of the reason may simply be just timing. We are trying to enter sectors where giants already are ruling. I know earlier we cautioned against aggressive industrial policy, but this paper offers a bit of a more balanced view. It does not really argue for protecting entire industries forever, but it does suggest that governments may need to defend certain rungs just long enough for capabilities to take root. It's not really about just picking winners, it's actually about keeping countries from being forced into losing games. Because in the end, the real debate is not just whether to open up or close off, it is actually, are you climbing the ladder or you are being pushed out of it? And that brings me to the end of the two stories of the day. On that note, let's move on to the final section and talk about the quick news headlines. First, on this episode, we've broken down China's journey towards chip self-sufficiency, and now a fresh milestone from its biggest rival shows just how far that frontier still lies for them. Now, this week, Nvidia became the first company in history to cross a $4 trillion market cap, which is a symbolic and a strategic milestone in the ongoing AI chip arms race. Now, that, mind you, is a 1000% surge since early 2023, and Nvidia now commands 7.5% of the S&P 500 index. Now, you might be wondering, why does this matter in China's context? And that is because the very reason Nvidia's stock has skyrocketed is what China's chip ecosystem is trying to replicate and compete with. But even its best effort seems to be lagging behind. Second, last month, SEBI issued a 149-page interim order against Sanjeev Bhasin, accusing him of running a coordinated front-running operation. This week, Bhasin has approached the Securities Appellate Tribunal, or SAT, challenging the order. In his plea, he has denied any wrongdoing, calling SEBI's directions perverse, arbitrary, and excessive. And he also argued that he personally received no direct monetary benefit. Third and the final one for the day, if you follow the show regularly, you might remember that we recently questioned whether Tata Motors was losing its ground, particularly in the EV sector. But it really looks like it is facing problems overall as well. Tata Motors reported a 9% year-over-year decline in global wholesales for Q1 of FY 2026, which totals 2.99 lakh units. The drop was attributed to the phasing out of older Jaguar models and a temporary halt in US shipments due to new tariffs. That's all the news and stories I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. This is your host Anurag Bansal signing off. Take care and have a great day. Bye-bye. Disclaimer: this content is for informational purposes only. None of the stocks, brands, or products mentioned are recommendations or endorsements.